In 1996, Apple was looking for a new operating system. macOS was outdated, Copeland was falling apart, and they needed something modern, stable and ready. Outside Cupertino, there were only a few serious candidates. One of them came from a small company called Be. Their system booted fast, supported preemptive multitasking and symmetric multiprocessing, and was built for low latency multimedia. Apple chose NeXT instead, but for a brief moment in time, BeOS almost became the new macOS. Under the dust, there's history waiting to boot. I'm the vintage collector, and these are my stories. Be Inc. was founded in 1990 by Jean-Louis Gasset and Steve Zackerman, both former Apple executives. Their goal was to design a new operating system from the ground up, optimized for digital audio and video, proudly touting it as the Media OS. At this point, desktop systems were still evolving from architectures rooted in the 1980s. Cooperative multitasking was common, multiprocessor systems were nowhere in sight for consumer machines, and multimedia was an afterthought. The first hardware target was AT&T's Hubble processor. That effort didn't last long, and Be shifted to PowerPC, the emerging ecosystem that Apple and others were betting on. In 1995, Be introduced their own workstation, the BeBox. It debuted with two 66 MHz PowerPC 603 processors. A year later, it was updated to dual 133 MHz CPUs. It was built around a fairly standard 80 form factor mainboard using mostly off-the-shelf components with PCI and ISO slots, SCSI and IDE, and 8 SIM sockets for RAM. On the front were so-called Blinkenlights, vertical LED bars showing system activity in real time. On the back, alongside serial and MIDI ports, audio in and out, there was something called the GeekPort. A 37-pin connector exposing digital and analog I/O lines designed for experimentation, robotics and custom electronics. The BeBox ran BeOS, an operating system developed specifically for this hardware. It was built around preemptive multitasking and symmetric multiprocessing from the start, with an object-oriented C++ API and heavily multi-threaded design. In fact, even the graphical user interface followed this philosophy, with every window running in its own thread. BeOS relied heavily on the so-called Media Kit, a framework designed to move audio and video data through the system with minimal latency. At the time, BeOS was widely praised by reviewers and users for its responsiveness and multitasking. Its focus on multimedia performance also attracted interest from parts of the creative community, including former Amiga users who saw BeOS as kind of a spiritual successor to the Amiga. But despite the technical ambition, Be sold only around 1800 systems in total. Be then decided to step away from hardware and focus entirely on software, a pattern we had seen before with NeXT as well. Production of the BeBox ended in early 1997, by which point BeOS had already been ported to the Macintosh. At the time, Apple had licensed its operating system to several clone manufacturers, and some of these companies, including Power Computing and Motorola, even bundled BeOS with their PowerPC-based systems. This marked a shift in strategy. Running BeOS on existing Apple hardware was a limiting factor, as consumer Macs were only single CPU machines. The multiprocessor advantage that had defined the BeBox was gone. And then there was no future here. If you watched my previous episodes on NeXTSTEP and the evolution of macOS X, you may remember how quickly the Apple clone market disappeared once Steve Jobs returned to Apple. While BeOS supported a range of PowerPC Macintosh systems, it did not support older 68K Macs and never supported PowerBooks. Later, New World Macs, introduced after 1998, were also incompatible due to firmware and hardware changes, which once again means I'm out of luck. My iBook G3 will not run BeOS, and the Mac Mini G4 won't either. And without an older beige PowerPC machine that I totally don't have, there's simply no Mac demo possible here. To understand why newer Macs were never supported, we have to rewind back to 1996. At the time, Be was in negotiations with Apple. Reports from the time suggest Be was seeking somewhere in the range of $275 to $300 million, while Apple was reportedly valuing the company closer to $125 to $200 million. Then, in late 1996, Apple acquired Next for roughly $429 million in cash and stock, bringing Steve Jobs back to Cupertino along with NeXTSTEP. At first glance, it sounds contradictory that Apple declined Be's valuation but paid significantly more for Next. The difference, however, was not just the operating system. Next brought a mature Unix foundation, a complete development environment, and Steve Jobs himself. From that point forward, Apple's operating system strategy centered on NeXTSTEP, which would eventually become macOS X. This chain of events meant BeOS no longer had a clear future on the Macintosh platform. Years later, Be's former CEO Jean-Louis Gasset reflected on those negotiations in an interview, joking that he knew Apple's management at the time and could hardly imagine working there again. So perhaps things worked out exactly the way they had to. In the end, with the Apple door effectively closed, Be's remaining opportunity lay in the Intel world. By 1998, with Release 3, BeOS had been ported to Intel x86, and the Intel version was likely the one most people actually experienced. In the upcoming episodes, we'll install BeOS ourselves and take a closer look at the system in action. And we'll also cover what happened to BeOS after the company sold off its assets to Palm in 2001. What about you? Did you ever run BeOS back in the day, maybe even on the original BeBox? Or were you one of the people discovering the free personal edition around the year 2000? Let me know down in the comments. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and see you again next Sunday.